Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. The Web Platform Podcast is a proud O'Reilly media partner. As such, one of the benefits we provide our listeners, that's you, are special discounts such as 50% off of eBooks and 40% off of printed materials. So this includes but is not limited to books on web technology, as well as other technologies we may be using. So your discount code is all caps PCBW. That's PCBW, all in caps. So head over to O'Reilly.com, that's OREILLY.com, right now to get all your favorite tech books at much lower prices.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 64. And we're going to be talking today about building interface animations. On our panel today, we have Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
Danny Blue.
Hey, everybody.
And myself, Eric Isaacson. And our guest today is Val Head. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, yeah, I'm glad to be here today. I'm Val Head, like you just said. I'm an independent designer, and I do a lot of consulting around web animation as well. So I teach people how to do all this stuff, what it's good for, and lately I've been helping a lot of people get motion and animation into their style guides so they can work on it team-wide and product-wide, which is super fun. And that's what I've been doing lately.
So building interactive design is something that, at least, maybe it's because I'm not a designer, it's something that's really, really hard to do, I find. I've done some animation in the past, and I always found it very difficult as far as getting that realism look. Whether it's like a cartoon or whatever, but getting that reality to bend.
Yeah.
So have you had trouble with this, especially on the web, since it's such a raw platform for animation?
Sometimes it's definitely tough, and I think a lot of it is kind of like a mental shift, like a mindset. We're so used to, on the web, like we were kind of forced to have static stuff all the time, right? It was either like you built a web standard site and it's going to be static, like nothing's going to move, or you go crazy and you build a Flash site, and there was no in between. So we got so used to that. I think most of us that stuck on the web side of things, we just like never had to deal with animation because we couldn't use it, so why would we ever learn about it? So it's definitely, you have to think about things a little bit differently and kind of think of those spaces in that time, right? Instead of just going from like page A to page B or state A to state B, there's now like this space between it, and it's not just this instant cut. You can add space, you can use the hard cut, whatever you want to do, but we have this choice and these tools we can use, so it is tough to get used to having them, right? It's kind of like we have all this power now, and what do we do with it?
Yeah, but for all that power that we do sort of have on the web now, I remember a time when, it was, hey, here's this After Effects animation I've done. Make this happen on the web. And, it was a miserable time, in the web development circle of life where I can't make that thing happen. Are the tools and sort of the ways that designers and interactive designers in particular think about the web different now that we do have more animation tools, but not necessarily the entire, scope of tooling that you still have with, a lot of the typical tooling that everyone used to use for interactive design?
Yeah, I think you have to make some adjustments, and I think that the best animation for the web comes from understanding the web first and kind of knowing what it is that we're working with and being familiar with our tools versus someone coming in, like you said, having this crazy After Effects file, using all these things that After Effects can do that the web just can't. It's After Effects is After Effects. There's plenty it can do that we maybe one day can do on the web, or maybe we never will. And there's a lot of things it can do we probably never want to do on the web. So the best stuff comes from understanding the web first, and then using animation to kind of meet the same goals we've always had to, support the user experience, make things easier to use, not necessarily just to show off. But I think, After Effects is still in there. We can still, if someone who understands the web and is familiar with the platform builds an After Effects thing and is like, hey, build this, if that communication is there between designer and developer, you could still totally work that way. A lot of people do, and in that case, it's just more the communication and understanding your medium and, not making a billion expressions or like crazy 3D effects that could never happen on the web. So Yeah, like trying to think of all the things After Effects can do that the web can't. It's probably a long list. But the web can do lots of stuff After Effects can't, because After Effects is totally not interactive. It's just movies. Good movies sometimes, but just movies.
Yeah, and you are right, that workflow can still work. I have actually very recent experience working that way with a designer, and you are right, where a lot of it then just comes down to, and so how it ended up happening is, this is the kind of thing that I want to do, and then we would go over and we would just tweak it back and forth, and then he would just sit down while I tweaked stuff on the in the actual app to get it as close to what he was thinking, or because it's a lot of times it's more about the spirit of the thing rather than just the like the pixel perfect, the exact curve of the animation and things like that. As long as you're getting what like that, like I said, the spirit of what they're after, a lot of times that's really all you need. And the web does give you a lot, like you said, does give you a lot of tools to achieve those things, even if they aren't 100%.
Yeah, because if you guys are using that way, I mean, if you're working with a designer that way, or using that After Effects, like that kind of motion comp as like a conversation piece, like a way to put what's in his head or her head in front of both of you, so you can both be talking about the same thing. And that's totally different than just like throwing that over the fence and being like, make this happen. Like, come on, jerks. But when it's like, that's what After Effects and a lot of these prototyping tools are so good for. We can talk about this stuff, we can dance around in meetings, but like having a thing that the whole team or everyone involved can look at and use to fuel that conversation, so you all know you're looking at the same thing, it's a huge benefit to being able to communicate between people of what what you're trying to achieve with animation and what you envision it might look like and why it should look like that. So it's a good way to do it. Good job. Well done.
Well, we talked generally about animation, but as far as After Effects is great, like as you said, for movies and motion graphics. I had some really great learning experiences from Dean Velez on some of that, where he did the motion graphics and intros to different films and shows. It was really cool, step-by-step tutorials to build that stuff, and that's really cool. But when you think about interfaces and designing those, typically in After Effects, what I've seen people do is that, like it used to be, they'd build DVD interfaces, or now it would be Blu-ray or whatever, and you look at like your cable company. Are you really pleased with that type of interface? Right?
Would anyone
Typically
say
not.
yes to that?
Yeah, I mean, if there's one out there, I think they should really package that up and sell it.
I'd like to see it.
Well, they have larger. They have other problems other than just the overall design. Most of the time, the design would be fine. They'd all just run like garbage.
That's true. Yeah.
What is it like 3 seconds trying to switch? 3 seconds trying to switch from one option to the next. So they got a whole other can of problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that though. It's like the usability too. Like the font sizes based on, if you have a 20-inch screen, they assume everyone has a 50-inch screen, and we do this on the web too. We assume people have Chrome or Firefox, the latest, and those people who have those old TVs, like I do upstairs, you'll see they don't sell them anymore, but they've lasted, and you'll see like that it looks really bad on like small ones, and they don't take those things into consideration, like the user experience and the UI, not just like, here's a mock-up in Photoshop and this is how it looks at exactly these pixel ratios. Well, there's how many different TVs, how many different molding sets come in there, and it's different sizes. And this is true on the web too. Have you had experiences with clients or even other designers or developers where this was something that was very successful, or this is something that totally failed? And we don't have to say client names or whatever, that's fine. But
I think the times it's most successful, I mean, as far as, like you're talking about getting animation in there in your interface as far as like across the board of various browsers, capabilities, and devices and all that good stuff, right?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes, animation is not the answer. Sometimes people just reach for those and say, these great transitions right away. And then some people argue, well, we need those right away so they can be consistent throughout the whole design. But then, when you're prototyping that, maybe you just have a quick click through or something, so you don't see that. So I don't know. There's different opinions, is my point, I guess. But yes, across all stuff. I know Netflix is working towards having this web interface on the TVs, but there's no standardization really.
Yeah,
So-
yeah. No, Netflix is all over the place with their interfaces, I find. Hopefully I guess they're working to put those together. But I think that, the best ways to make that go well is to just start, thinking about animation really early in your process and know what it's there for. If you're like, this animation is there to help step our users through this, multi-step form or activity or I guess thing they're trying to do, or it's there to give them feedback to let them know that, hey, they really did move this product into this category, or it's there to give them feedback to say, hey, that thing really is out of your cart or is in whatever you're doing. Having a really good purpose for it to begin with and knowing exactly why it's there, that's kind of the biggest key, because that's going to make sure you're focused on adding things that are actually going to improve the experience and make things easier for people to use, as opposed to just like stuff flying around because it can, which is rarely going to help anyone. But we see it happens, and there is room for playfulness. And I know delight has a terrible reputation and everyone hates the word, but like there is a place for that. But you want to start with a more, I guess, for lack of a better word, serious uses of just like, what are we trying to accomplish? What is this helping? How is this giving feedback? Is it helping people orient to like, we often have these really layered interfaces, especially on small screens. Is it helping them see what's off screen and where it went and knowing where to find it again? There's so many of these things with like orientation and feedback and causality that we can illustrate with animation. And it's not the only way we can illustrate it. We can use our other design tools like hierarchy and color and everything, but we can use animation for that too, and it can be a really helpful way. So if you're aiming for that kind of stuff first, it has more purpose and becomes more of like the actual, I guess, user flow and the actual experience as opposed to this like icing on top. And that's also easier to make consistent, right? If you're like, hey, we've decided in our app we're going to use animation to transition between states or for entrances and exits of all our modals or extra, top layer objects, I guess. You can do that on any size screen. It might be coming in a smaller distance because you've got a smaller screen, but if they always slide in from the left, you've got that consistency, or whichever direction you choose. So you can make, animation is one of those things that you can make really consistent in that sense across all of your screens. Especially if you're looking for something to be consistent, it's one of the things that can be.
But does that consistency come in at? Do we lack that on the web? I mean, to some extent, we lack affordances because we don't take into account the consistency that we have because we do have so many platforms, right? Because affordances isn't a word that a typical web developer is going to hear, but in design, you're going to hear affordances a lot, right? You want to make sure that you're representing the action possibilities that you have across the board. And I sometimes wonder that because the web doesn't have a style guideline, you look at sort of the platform world where Android has a style guideline, you have material design, and then you look at iOS and Apple has a very standard design language they use consistently, and then all apps sort of partake in this, and they have an initial set of affordances that we know are going to be for these possibilities, for these sorts of ins and outs. But on the web, we seem to have sort of diverged into this land of, well, I don't need a style guide. I'm just going to randomly put a whole bunch of stuff together, and it's all going to work. Have we gotten too far away from that for our end users? Are we making our end users' lives kind of a living hell?
I don't think so. I mean, I kind of like that the web is a little more democratic in that sense, that there is no single style guide for the web. I mean, we kind of, in a way, they become implied, right? Like, I'm thinking of like Jen Simmons' recent talk about layouts and stuff, where she basically does these little diagrams of like what all websites look like big hero image, button in the middle. Like there are certain things we all kind of gravitate towards. And sometimes it's just because they're trendy, but sometimes it's because that might actually be the best way to demonstrate or, show that these things are possible, or the best way to help people get through certain tasks. And there's a lot of common tasks we have on the web, right? Like reading, filling out forms. So I think some of them we've kind of solved over time that maybe we identify more as trends than as a style guide. But also we have that freedom to just like totally toss that aside and maybe come up with something better, which I think is pretty fun. Of course, we often make mistakes along the way, and there's some terrible UI, but we're never going to have not terrible UI on the web. I mean, that's some of the beauty of it, right? Like, a person or a company that makes the ugliest, most unusable web pages can put them up just like someone making something beautiful and easy to use, and that's sort of the web, for better or worse.
I think for developers, though, like, like we have Bootstrap and we have
Mhm.
material design and we
Other
have the
stuff
Android
too.
design and all these things. I think they do give us an idea of, oh, this is trendy or this is something that's
Mhm.
worked for a large group of people. But what I've found is a lot of those, they tend to box us in.
Yep. You get
So we
trapped in
tend to
them.
like look at it as, well, it has to be like this because we're building it. And if you look at the different frameworks, they each have their own sort of way that they approach the world of interaction,
Mhm.
right? So, I mean, right now, the new hotness is material design, right? Because that,
Yeah.
that spans across technologies.
But it's
But I
still
mean,
something that
Not all
Google made,
technologies.
right? It's still something that Google
yeah,
made
it's
for
true.
you to make Google apps. It's not really for the whole internet, despite I think it's really strange actually how so many people have assumed that this is just the new way we design everything. It's like, no, Google made this for Google things. It's not, you don't have to use it. You're not required to use it. I find it really curious that so many people have been like, this is the way we do things now. Which
Hmm.
is great for Google, right? They made this thing and everyone's pushing their branding and their ideas and their solutions, just like kind of grabbing it almost mindlessly. Material design's become equated with so many things that it's like not
Yeah, it's
really.
it's kind of brilliant. They've taken it to that next step where Bootstrap said, hey, this is a boilerplate.
Hmm.
Take this and change it, but here are all our defaults. And what
Yeah.
happened? Developers
Well,
just went in and they said, "Oh, we love the defaults. They look much prettier than our IE8 little boxes." And
well,
we
but
have
that's the
rounded
kicker,
corners
though,
now.
right? Is that developers aren't designers, and for so
Right.
many developers, they don't have designers to help them sort of
Yeah.
come up with this sort of interaction that we want as developers.
Hmm.
Because we know as developers that we need the interactions, that we need consistency across, not just our own websites, but a variety of devices now. And that is a very difficult thing to do when you are
Yeah.
not trained at all in
Hmm.
design. So when you have things like Bootstrap or material design or things like foundation themes and everything else, they're very attractive and they get a lot of uptick, not necessarily because they're the best or the greatest,
Hmm.
but because they're available and readily usable, where I don't need to design now. It kind of works for me, right? So we have
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
gap, and I don't know how you overcome that gap.
Like even material design, like I said, they've taken it to that next level where they've
Hmm.
actually said this is a design language,
Yep.
right? So
Yeah.
take this as this is not just code, but this is a way of living the interface, right? So
Hmm.
you take it and you're supposed to make it your own, but use these principles
Yeah.
behind that. And I don't think I haven't seen anything that does that now. So they've sort of like now everything is going to start to look like Google more and less Bootstrap,
Yeah.
and that's great
Yeah.
for them, like you said. But it
Good
is
branding job,
an
Google.
opportunity. It is an opportunity though for designers and visual designers, especially, and interactive designers to kind of push that and say, we need to go beyond this, and these are the reasons why.
Yeah, I mean, I get the convenience of all these frameworks and material design and stuff, but personally, I'm like, I want to build the stuff I want to design the stuff and build the stuff that's different and not using that. Like, I feel like to me it would be really disappointing. Or just be like, hey, we'll just make it material design, and that would not be a good solution for me. It's like let's make this product or this site or whatever we're working on have its own personality, and it doesn't really take that much to be different. If you change just a couple of things, and most of the time you want to focus on just these sort of like, um, like your hero interaction or the main thing people are hoping to do. If you make that really good and maybe make that one a little different, not just for the sake of being different, but solve it in a way that makes sense to you and your brand or your product. You've already got that one big thing that's just a little different than the rest of that stuff that we've all seen a million times. I mean, I guess material design still looks kind of new, but in like a year from now, is it still going to look new, or is it going to be like all the Bootstrap sites where we're all like, "Yep, Bootstrap."
It's all yeah, no, it's all eventually everything that is new is eventually old, right?
Yep, yep.
But kind of bringing some things back to like the interaction animations and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things about material design is that it's not just like, okay, here's flat images for what things are going to look like. Like the button ripple, like is a really good example of just one.
Yeah.
I hate the button ripple.
That's good though. You have opinions about it.
Yeah.
I mean, we need to have opinions about this stuff.
But the fact that it is there, that they have like
Mhm.
they have an interaction and animation style as well as just their flat as well as just the flat, which is, I guess, more of Bootstrap of here's how to just make it not look ugly. They give you some of these other interactions as well, and I think that may be one of the reasons that Bootstrap has the material
design,
has started to become so popular because it gives you that extra level. And anybody, if you take the exact same website, app, anything with absolutely no animations, and you add in a few very subtle animations, the one with the animations is going to appear like it's a higher quality, or something along those lines. Now, you shouldn't be able to tell. You shouldn't be able to point and say, like, this animation is the reason that this looks better than this as the end user. But those being there, those little pieces add up to make the experience feel more, I don't know if professional is the right word, but make it feel more solid.
Yeah, no, that's totally true, and I think it really is true. It's like these little subtle transitions, even things you add that you kind of want to be invisible, right? Like I love the term invisible animation, kind of like invisible design. These things that you add that people may not be like, I like that interface because this state transitioned to this state, and then this button appeared, and then I knew what I was doing. Like, no one is going to say that out loud. But they'll get that overall impression of, like you said, that sophistication. And I think that's partly the kind of time that we're in right now, and the fact that the main thing we see with moving interfaces is probably like our iPhones or our iPads. And so by seeing these animated interfaces, we kind of like 3 or 4 steps away associate them with Apple and newness and like cool, sophisticated things. So partly that's because it's so new, but it is really interesting how much we've come to expect that from interfaces. Seeing interfaces that are static and are just like click link, go to next page, that feels old. Even though that's what the web's been for ages, and we've been dealing with that for ages. Now that we're all carrying around like touchscreen computers in our pocket, we're like, it's old and that's not sophisticated. That's like too retro or something. So it's really interesting how just in general, as like people who use interfaces and computers, are like our whole impression just changed of what we expect from these things.
And interaction design is relatively new. I mean, when you think about sort of its uprising in sort of the history of design, because interactive design sort of came out of the computing revolution that started to happen in the 60s. So it is a relatively new sort of approach to figuring out how interface extends from underlying design, right? I mean, we know that the system does X, and we know that a blue link probably means that I'm going to go somewhere else and read something else. But have we gotten to the point now where, have we forgot about less? Have we forgot that at some point, sometimes it is just me moving from page A to page B to do something else, as opposed to I'm going to shoot fireworks off and transition from left to right.
How will you know you're on a different page if there's some sort of an explosion?
Yeah, without explosions, how do you know you've gone to a new site? That is a good question. I really like fireworks. I don't know if I'd like them on every website I ever saw. But you're right though. There's a context and a content appropriateness that has to be there. Whatever animation you're using has to fit what you're saying and what you're doing. And that's why so many of these parallax sites are just like horrible, or these like scroll jacking things, because you're like, no, if they just don't make any sense. The motion they're using is so far removed from like the task at hand or their message that it just feels so wrong. And it's kind of funny in a way, because if you think about some of the first parallax sites, like that Nike, what was it called? Nike Better World. It was like a story, and it had very subtle parallax, and it actually fit really well. Big Spaceship did a site a few years ago that was for like a fizzy water drink, and they had bubbly parallax, and like it was a little over the top, but it fit. It was a marketing site for water. It totally fit in that sense. But then you see things like a car dealership where it's like cars flying by, or I don't even know what. You're like, no, I want like your contact information and what you sell. Go away with this stuff.
I also hate parallax.
It's yeah, there's so few cases where parallax is useful, and we just are using it for everything.
Yeah. Well, it is cool. So this actually leads into one of the reasons that I hate parallax is that a lot of the people's implementations of a parallax scrolling type thing, the performance is terrible. Because they're doing parallax like on these enormous images in the background, and just the scrolling performance is really, really bad.
Yeah.
And that coming back to that thing of at that point it does not that is forefront. An animation that might be really cool, as soon as you start stuttering and it's a little bit janky, you notice it in a big bad way.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've seen some websites that almost make me sick.
Like
a lot of them don't even have responsive images though either, and that causes like like if you're on a God forbid a BlackBerry or something, like then you're scrolling down and you have this like megabytes of graphic because it was a desktop version.
Yeah, I mean the web mobile is again a whole other can of worms when it comes to performance stuff with those things. But I'm even talking about like desktop, like on my gaming computer, and I'll be scrolling on the website. Trouble. It's like this should work. There should not be a reason this should not work. But they're still out there. And it looks great, but I'm sorry, I can't do this.
But it doesn't look great if it's all like stuttery.
When it's standing still.
When the animation isn't moving, it looks wonderful.
I want to pull it back to mobile though for a second too.
Yeah.
Like that was a concern I had. So like if you work with a large group for a large project, and this isn't for everybody, let's say, but I guess the concepts could translate. But if you have like a large team and you're working with a large design team, typically I've seen like first you get like these like 90-page PDFs that have all of the pages like just loosely put out for wireframes, right? And then weeks later you'll get some mock-ups for sections of those in Photoshop. Mind you that almost all of these are in desktop.
Right.
So with a large team, depending on if it's a line of business type of application or if it's a desktop only, which is like really bizarre to me now in today's design age. How do you instill processes to enforce like faster design of the interface and more effective usage of the time for all the team, not just design but for engineering as well, integrating with that? Because it doesn't seem like an efficient process. What are your tips for that?
Oh yeah, it's like our old kind of waterfall process is just even more. I mean, it holds you back in trying to design for like current times, and it is so time consuming. I think that you sort of have to change your deliverables in a sense, like instead of trying to, and it's not an easy change to make by any means. I know this, but instead of being like, here we're going to wireframe out every single thing or mock up every single screen, it's sort of like you kind of need to pick the most important ones and sort of take that most important one or that most important, not even necessarily screen, but like maybe task or user flow or something, and figure out how is that going to display on different sizes of screens? How is that task going to change? How is the way you're going to interface with it change? Do we need to move things around? Or give different cues as to what's going on based on the smaller sizes. And it's a really hard change to make. And I think that's why we see a lot of like folks like Dan Mall talking about element collages or Samantha Warren talking about style tiles, just these ways to get to some faster design solutions in a sense that things that you can get to faster so you can throw them out faster if you need to or move forward with them faster. We almost need to make more time to like make mistakes in a sense or come up with things that we know are wrong and be able to get rid of them before they become precious so we can get faster to that like better solution. And it's really tough to change large team processes. So I know it's a hard thing to change.
And what's your interaction been with engineering? And so like you have engineering groups, but you're in sprint 0, we have to actually deliver something by the end of this sprint. Maybe it's a week, maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe it's 3. So like something like it's not usually lined up the way that okay, well, we have some things we can work with now. The design team has given us this, and we can work with this. We have functional specs or whatever on this. We can start working on these things, and they can work on these other things, and we'll expect that for next week. Sometimes that gets that drags on a little bit. For smaller projects, it's especially if you're in a startup or whatever, that's not such an issue because you just turn to the guy or the lady next to you and you're like, hey, can you tell me something here? What's this about?
Yeah.
But when you have a large team, especially spanning across continents or even nationwide, that can be much more challenging.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's like the communication almost becomes the most important part of any process when we're trying to work with responsive and all these various platforms and devices, and that's like the hardest part of having distributed teams, especially when you're all working in different time zones and stuff. Keeping up that communication is tough.
Does management rush design? Because I mean, we there's a lot of cases where we talk about making mistakes, and as developers, we make mistakes all the time that we don't talk about because
they're embarrassing.
But mistakes are an important part of any sort of development and/or creative process. Like you have to, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
Yeah.
Horrible analogies that everybody loves.
It's a good one.
You need that time. And to me, for a lot of things these days, it seems like people want to compress the important phases of really large things. So you end up with, hey, we're designing product A, and we're going to have a design phase that's like a week and a half long because we need to get it out the door. What needs to happen these days? Like, how can we as developers and designers say, you know what, we all need to step back and really think about this before we commit down this road? Because once you go down that road, it's hard to recover quickly. Like, you're not going to recover quickly in a lot of cases.
No, definitely. I think it's a case of, design has to be important from the top down, right? Who's ever making those timelines, if it's management or whoever else, they need to realize the importance of design in a business sense. Like, to them, it's rarely that they want it to look pretty, but they want it to be used by a lot of people. They want a bunch of users. They want it to be successful. And without good design, that's pretty tough to do. Like, you need something that's very well designed to achieve those goals. And so I think if you have management that sees that connection and believes in design as a business objective or something that helps you get to your business goals, then you'll be in a lot better shape. But I guess if you don't, the hard task is convincing them.
Yeah.
And showing them that, which there's so many great examples of apps out there that are doing well and are really well designed, and it's pretty hard to make an argument that they're doing well, that the design isn't helping with that. If you think about if Stripe was ugly, would anyone use it?
Well, there's a lot of case studies, right? I mean, that is the kind of difference now. You look at a list of parts, I love parts, been around for a long time now. But beforehand, I can't really remember as a developer people talking about design in sort of the way we talk about design now, where it is much more important than it seems to have been 10 years ago.
Oh,
where,
definitely.
It was important in certain fields, obviously in advertising and a lot of the design sort of fields, but the web was relatively new. And now it seems to be on par now where people do at least want to hear and see what that data is. And your Etsy's of the world and your Netflix and everybody sort of releases these big studies where there's raw data that says, what, this design did not work, but this one did, and here's the context brought to this problem, and here's what we think our users are doing. Because we never really know, right?
Yeah, you don't.
We can't.
But at least we're looking at it.
Yeah, exactly, right? We have to bring our own context from the data that we have for the design and the implementations we do. So I think it is better now. I just
definitely.
It can always be a little better too, right?
I think just because overall it still has to get down into all the different teams and everyone's various companies. But yeah, it's design used to be such even design itself was such an afterthought and just we'll do it at the end and whatever, we'll make it work and then we'll just decorate it. And it's so great to see that attitude kind of almost being gone now, because that's just not how we work anymore. And I think everything on the web is better for it, really. Trying to decorate something later as opposed to just designing something.
And that's kind of how user experience emerged as a field, right?
Yeah, because it became design not just how it looks, but how it works, how the kind of that user application conversation, how it interfaces. That's terrible, but it's true. How it interfaces with your user. We realize that that's just as important as the server call coming back successfully. It's strangely, people care more about how it feels to them than what the computers think.
Is there, the same way as in the engineering world, there's technical debt, can there also be design debt? Because a lot of stuff in engineering doesn't it's a lot like we were talking about with animations. You only notice it when it's broken, that kind of stuff, or when it doesn't work well. But when you do get in these types of situations that we've been talking about, where it needs to get out the door, so we're gonna so design gets done as quickly as possible, engineering gets done as quickly as possible, and then always chance for mistakes. But so then you rack up. There's usually a pretty measurable amount of technical debt that you accrue when you are moving too quickly or making mistakes, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there also such thing as design debt, where you have things that you want to do, but things that maybe like I said, things you can't get done in the time frame, and then stuff just gets piling up, and it feels more like more patchwork than one cohesive piece?
Yeah, I think you can definitely get into that situation where you just almost like you have too high of an expectation or just like too many goals for like a first release or something, and you can't get to nearly all of them. I think we have to sort of think about it, especially when it comes to like the whole idea of like the minimum thing you can release, the minimum viable product, all that stuff, is like realizing that needs to be, and this is a dessert metaphor, I'm totally stealing from someone else, but I can't think of who, it might be Kenneth, but like that each minimal thing should be like a slice of cake and have all the layers, as opposed to don't just give them like, I don't know, if it's like a chocolate Oreo cake, don't just deliver the Oreo crust the first round. You need to have a little bit of crust, a little bit of chocolate, a little bit of whipped cream, a little bit of crumbled Oreos, and even if it's a tiny piece, that's better than only having, like a big crust with nothing in it. So yeah, AKA, baking metaphor.
AKA the Ford Taurus in the late 90s.
There was nothing wrong with the Ford Taurus in the late 90s.
It was very bubbly. It was not right. It was that was design debt if there ever was design debt.
It was a quality automobile that was built like a tank and survived at least 2 accidents. Not just saying.
From experience, I take it? From experience.
I never drove a Ford Taurus. I don't know. But anyway.
To take it back to your example of Stripe, though, too, I mean, you have this visually impressive thing. Mm-hmm. What if Stripe was like, had too many interactions, it was not usable, its flows didn't work correctly? Do you think that people, the users, would be like, wow, this is so great, they'd implement it, and then once it got started, they'd be like, wait a second, what's going on? Because that visual thing is the first thing you see, right? But then as you start using it,
I think you can get some people on pure visual beauty, right? Like we all love things that are beautiful, but especially something like if it just looked beautiful but worked like crap, I don't think it would be anywhere. People would catch on pretty fast, just be like, nope. Part of the reason it is so great is that they just integrate everything. Like everything just meshes together so well. It is very well designed, but in every sense of design, like the way it is to use it, the user experience, the steps, the way it steps you through it. On all facets of design, it's done really well. It's not just like beautiful polish on top of thing that kind of works. And that's the hardest stuff to do, right? To get design well and done right through all of those various ways. It takes iteration. Probably the very first time they did it, it wasn't as nice as it is now. They seem to always be improving on it. I mean, I run into Stripe a lot with various payment things. I feel like it's always just a tiny bit different, tiny bit improved.
Well, I kind of feel it's just like coding, like design in general is like coding. I think that's how I ended up doing coding, right? Yeah. Because of all these visual things like I learned from art school that sort of translated into coding and patterns in coding. Yeah. And so I can totally see that.
Yeah, I was just speaking at a design conference this past weekend, and it was like very, very graphic design heavy. And it's kind of funny getting some of these questions about like, oh, as a designer, do I have to learn how to code because it's so hard and it's so different from design? And to me, I'm like, they just seem so similar. I mean, once you learn a little bit of code, especially when you're dealing with web things, and I think it's the same from the other end too, if you're a developer and you learn a little bit of design when it comes to the web, you realize how much overlap there is and how much they have in common. And it's kind of a very similar mindset, whether you're developing or designing, because you're aiming for the same goals. And it's not like these two distant worlds.
That first milestone is really hard, though, right? Because that whole mindset of these are arrays and these are variables and these are, that stuff I found difficult. But then once that clicked, then you're absolutely.
Yeah, and the same thing like type and like color theory all seems really hard when you know nothing about it. And you just have to get past, I mean, it is hard when you know nothing about it, but once you get past some initial learning and just become, get over that first, I guess, hill or that first hump, you're like, okay, this isn't so bad. You get a little knowledge under your belt and suddenly things make so much more sense, which is like
everything's hard until it's easy, right?
Everything's hard until you're really good at it. But we forget, right? Whatever you learned first, you kind of forget the efforts you put into to get that good at it. So you're like, oh, design's so easy, but programming's hard. But it's just like, no, it's because you know design, or whichever one you know first. It always seems easier.
Have you ever gone into like a project where you were brought in as a consultant, let's say, and there's this team there, and they don't know, they're very new. There's no like leader. Have you had to take a team like that and take them from their art, their talents, and turn that into a craft and then a practice? Have you had to grow them through that? And if you have, how did you do that?
I haven't had to do anything like that, but that sounds like a pretty interesting challenge, though. I feel like you need something like a little bit more permanent than a consultant to do that, don't you? Like to hold you through that whole timeline, or that seems like it would take time.
Well, yeah, if you're a long-term consultant, for sure,
you could do
that.
It's not a one-day job.
Yeah, I mean, consultant, you can. People might even think you're a full-time employee there.
Yeah,
you have
that's
a badge
true,
and
that's
everything,
true.
right?
Yeah.
But that's hard. Like you're.
It's not easy.
Have you done it?
Yeah, have you done it, Eric?
I have not successfully done it. No.
Oh. There sounds like there's a story there.
Well, I wasn't there long enough either, and there's lots of different political things that go on in these organizations that you don't have control over. So if the groups are on the same mindset and you have all that same control across the different areas, then you can do a lot with that. I mean, I was able to get a process in place for coding, to get cross-browser testing, and have some practices in. But some of it went away because of different management, because of different things that the project did, and things change over time, right? And some of the goals for the project change, and with that, some of these processes go. So yeah, not successfully where it's stuck, but yeah, I've achieved small victories, but nothing at a very large scale with that.
Well, when you don't have a cheerleader who continuously pushes that thing, it becomes very difficult to see it continuously succeed. Because that's the kicker with any practice, and it doesn't really matter what business you're in, right? If you don't have someone there to sort of, doing that raw, don't worry, it's going to work, just stick to the process, we're going to get there, and then you see a lot of sort of success in it, where it becomes ingrained in that culture. Yeah, that's hard, and I think that's why going in as a consultant and doing it is hard, because you may come up with, a very reasonable set of design guidelines, a style guide. You might have,
I think it puts you in a better position, actually, because now you're not subject to those politics that those people are subject to.
You can kind of move around outside of it and be like, because it doesn't impact you long term, hopefully.
That's not always true.
It's not always true. It depends. I've been in a lot of places where they have consultantitis, where the consultants know more, and that's not the case. But it gives you a little more leverage as far as like your voice and what you can suggest to them. Versus if I'm a full-time employee, I might feel a little restricted. Like, I better not say this because this goes against kind of the culture of what we do here. Yeah. And culture is going to win every time.
But
so if you can change that culture, then that's great. But if you can't, I don't know.
And bringing in an outside voice, I think, is just a solution for people that are inside that culture and need to change something. I mean, it's not as large of a scale, but I get brought in a lot as a consultant to like teach web animation workshops. Not so much because people are like, oh God, we can't figure out SVG and CSS ourselves. It's because there's one or two people in that organization that think this is important. They want their designers and developers to focus on this, but they need someone to come in from outside to basically verify their opinion. And they bring me in, they're basically like, look, she thinks this is important too, so let's get on this. And that's kind of, almost the bigger reason I'm brought in, less so to teach them this stuff, but or at least teach the code parts of it, but just the kind of importance of it and what it's good for. And it seems to work, so that's good. I'm happy to help in those cases.
Code part. Sorry, Eric. You want to?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
No, I was just going to say though that's that whole mentality of get it done. And there's no like, well, let's take time to actually come up with a strategy long-term for this and not just tactics. Do.
I think it's also kind of one step along the way. Like, if you can convince everyone this thing is important, then it's important enough to put into your overall strategy or your overall process. And you kind of have to get people to feel it's important first before they'll pay enough attention to use it in a bigger, I guess, the grander scheme.
Yeah.
you mentioned the code part, which I'm a fan of. For a good while now, we've had CSS animations and things like that, which aren't really interactive. So you can do, transitions and transforms and things like that to move things around on certain events, and then maybe you can use a little bit of JavaScript to do stuff. But you have something that happens over a period of time. So like keyframe animations in CSS are a really good example. So you have a series of you define a timeline, and then you want something to interact that way. You can't really interrupt it very easily. There's no built-in way to do that. Now we have something that a lot of browsers have with request animation frame, where you can do fully interactive things. And so I'm curious how those two design ideas are different. One from here's kind of a cause and effect type thing, and here's something that's going to happen over a fixed timeline, versus now we can do things where people can I can make sentences. I promise. Now you can build sites or apps where you can have a lot of interaction, like almost like Flash. Anybody that doesn't know what request animation frame is, you should go look it up. But pretty much it runs a function that you define every animation frame. So I know it's a terrible way, but so ideally run 60 times.
It's like in the name but not in the name. Yeah.
It's not like set interval, but it does run something ideally 60 times a second.
Yeah,
so
as fast as the browser reasonably can.
Yeah.
Essentially.
So if you've ever done like any programming in Flash or something like that back in the day, where you would say like if button down move character plus X, right? You can do things that are very similar in that, and a lot of game engines.
They use that same approach. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and a lot of them use request animation frame now. So, like, if you look up like 3JS tutorials and I want to animate things, they always tell you to write a render function and then use request animation frame in it.
Yeah.
So I went this way a little bit. But so, is there a difference between designing for those two different paradigms?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, CSS can be flexible in a similar way, especially with transitions. Those are completely interruptible, and they'll go back and forth. And you can, of course, you need to use JavaScript for the logic, because CSS, being a markup language, though it's beautiful and wonderful, it just doesn't have that logic capability right now. I don't know if that's a whole other thing, whether it ever will, but there's certain logic you can't do without JavaScript, without some proper programming language. But transitions are really interruptible. Animations, I like to tell people to think of them as like old grumpy cats on your couch. CSS keyframe animations, they will do what you told them to do, but you better not change your mind, because they're just going to be like, what? No. And transitions are kind of more like kittens. You can move the laser pointer wherever you want. It will keep going, and it never gets tired. So see, I can do cat metaphors too. But there is a point where you get to that situation where you need more complex logic. Even if you're not going as far as a game necessarily, you kind of pointed to it when you said if you had this overall timeline, when you want to have this sort of, I guess, object or this timeline that knows everything that's happening, and it isn't just these independent animations that are, you can connect CSS animations with delays and stuff, but once you get past 3 or 4 and you have to edit that, your brain's going to hurt. So they kind of get to that point where you need that overarching logic. That JavaScript is kind of the only thing that can do it, because it's our web programming stuff, and between request animation frame and having that constant thing checking and knowing globally what's going on, you need that for those more, I guess, higher levels of interactivity. Anything getting close to a game, or the old Flash sites and that kind of thing. So you do cross a point where you need that higher amount of logic, I think, and I usually make that decision based on how much of a headache it would be to do, I guess, or how much you need to keep track of. And if animations need to be aware of other animations, you're going to need to move to some sort of JavaScript library or do your own thing with request animation frame, definitely, unless you really like pain, which I don't think many people do.
Yeah, it depends on how much pain, though.
Do you like just to be a little masochistic and kind of make it hard for yourself?
Well, if everything's too easy and you have everything that you want, then you'll never grow and get better. But if you have a little bit of pain, a little bit.
And this is where we learn a lot of things about a lot of people.
Yeah, okay, so...
I've seen your JavaScript classes. If that doesn't summarize pain, I don't know.
Oh no! But that's true to a point. Like we do crazy stuff with CSS. We draw like MacBooks in CSS and like illustrate this stuff that like, why are we doing with CSS? Just because we can, and you can take that pretty far with animation too. But if you, unlike Eric, if you don't like pain, you might want to try JavaScript instead.
Well, I like different pain, right? So you have this pain. I'll stop here. So yeah, it's true though. I mean, you look at like CSS Weekly or something, and there's every issue has like a new, hey, here's a minion in total CSS.
Yeah.
Here's this in total CSS.
And it's amazing.
You're like, how is that possible even? And then you see it and you're like, whoa. How did they think of this? And I think that's great because that's a whole other thing, like outside of interfaces and outside of this, that we could take a lot of inspiration and draw in from these artists that are on there, like on Tutor, and doing all these crazy animations with different types of shapes and math, stuff like that. Are you familiar with Brett Victor?
His name sounds really familiar, but I can't think of what his work is.
So he's Worry Dream on Twitter.
Yes.
He doesn't tweet a lot.
Okay, I know who you're talking about.
He did this video a while back called Inventing on Principle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this sort of taught me that until we have better visual tools like what Chrome's working on in their dev tools, what Firefox is working on in their dev tools, to make this more of that visual experience, we're not really going to see the power of these tools, the power of these APIs, because, I mean, he had it there where he said that if you think of in modes, you have this disconnect where I'm coding, I go back, I look at the visuals and see what happens. You have to have it all there so that you can see it together.
That immediate feedback loop of like, I just coded this, this is what it did, I need to change it or whatever. Yeah, and there's so much we have to keep in our heads with the way especially the way we work with CSS and even JavaScript animation, all this stuff. We have to keep it all in our heads, what we think it's doing, and we're so far removed from the visual results of what it is we're coding.
Yeah, I mean, he even had like an editor where he's like, moving stuff around and it's changing this tree.
Yeah,
there was
a
Super Mario game type of thing where, he's like, okay, now we'll just go through this timeline, and you would see the different Mario things like you would in Flash if you were editing frames, right? You would see like the frames would fade back, and he had like a touch interface for doing video editing. Very, very advanced, especially I think this came out like 2011 or 2012.
Yeah, it was a while ago, but it was really cool.
For the time, and people have been trying to create based on that inspiration these things. So I think it's an exciting time for interaction.
Definitely. I mean, we have kind of outgrown our current tools, and no one's really solved our tool problem yet. On any front, prototyping, building, all of this stuff, it's kind of this crazy wild west of tools right now. Which is actually pretty exciting because I think we're going to end up with some really good ones. We just haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah. Well, I know we're a little bit over time, so I want to respect that and let you get going. But if people want to find you, what's your Twitter handle? How can people chat with you about these things? Or you have a podcast. What's the podcast? All that stuff.
Yeah. So the best way to reach me, I guess, is Twitter. I'm VLH on Twitter. If you're super into web animation and UI animation, I have a newsletter called the UI Animation Newsletter. It's at uianimationnewsletter.com. Send it out every couple of weeks, talking about all this stuff. Lots of little tidbits and helpful links. Because I think it's good to keep this stuff in mind. And then I also do a podcast with my friend Kenneth Bowles. It's called Motion and Meaning. And even though it might seem a little silly to have an audio show about animation, we talk through a lot of things about process, about planning. We just released an episode on physics, which I thought was really interesting because Kenneth has a physics degree. I have not done physics since high school, so it was super interesting, and just talking about how physics apply to the things we do as interface designers. So super interesting stuff.
Very cool. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was really fun, guys.
Cool.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it was a blast.
Yay, thanks.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at +the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at eIsaacson
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.